Marvel's Shang-Chi, The Legend of the Ten Rings, is a strange movie that is very indicative of the time that we're currently living in, especially when it concerns the film market. On one hand, it is a movie meant and marketed in such a way that they're trying to garner the same domestic reaction from Asian audiences that Black Panther did for Black audiences. But on the other hand, the movie is clearly aimed at the overseas Chinese movie market, really showing us how far movies have changed in just our lifetime. Now the movies are about doing okay domestically and raking in all the money internationally, especially in China, and this movie, more than any other Marvel movie, is proof positive of that. However, that doesn't tell us whether or not the movie is really good. It doesn't tell us whether or not Marvel struck fool's gold or actual gold. Oh my god, I'm saying gold. We gotta go into the sponsor, then we're gonna come back. Great transition to me. Wow, wow, wow. Have you ever heard of shrinkflation? Well, if you're not aware of the term, it's best to think of it as a stealth way of inflating the currency. This is where you get less burger, less candy bar for every dollar that you spend, and everybody pretends like things are normal. But despite the fact that we see shrinkflation everywhere, the Fed just claims that this isn't a problem. But Noble Gold has got you covered. If you open up a precious metal IRA, you can keep up with the rising prices, hedge against inflation, and retire worry-free. And this month, they're giving away a giant America the Beautiful 5-ounce coin to anybody who signs up for one of these IRAs. If you want to sign up, go to my affiliate links, pinned comment, top of the description, or call them at 877-646-5347. Again, that's 877-646-5347. Get this ridiculously awesome oversized coin. It's heavy, it's weighty, it's 5 ounces. I kind of love it, and I'm going to keep it with me forever as a treasure. So there is a weird reaction and energy around this latest Marvel movie in a way that I don't think I've seen for any other Marvel movie previous. In a lot of ways, as I talked about in the beginning of this video, it is similar to Black Panther, as in the backlash is quite similar to the backlash of Black Panther, which was clearly marketed as a movie that was somehow correcting evil racism that was in Marvel for headlining their movies with the biggest characters that they had at the time that they started the MCU. But on the other hand, there hasn't been this outpouring of support from the domestic Asian audience that Marvel has expected. The marketing team behind this movie did not do a good job. In fact, when the movie was coming out, I was actually surprised because I had just seen the Spider-Man trailer and honestly hadn't heard much about it. Also, the backlash side is pointing to the idea that this movie is a financial flop. And whether or not that is true is actually quite questionable, because how are you grading this movie? If you're doing it just based on numbers pre-pandemic level, then obviously it's a financial flop. It's at around $150 million, and the movie costs about $200 million to make, and you have to imagine that there's about $150 million in the marketing, because typically you double the actual budget in order to get the marketing budget, and that's what you have to hit to break even, and this movie isn't close. But if we're judging it as a post-pandemic movie, like the way that we don't expect a lot of people to go out to theaters because they might not be ready to do so, it's actually doing pretty well by that standard. Also, even though this movie was designed for the overseas Chinese market, even though there's large portions of the movie where they are speaking Chinese, which makes it way easier to translate it for the overseas Chinese market, the movie is currently banned in China because the Communist Party of that nation is very sketchy about any movies that delve into the past of China, because they're afraid, like all authoritarian governments are, that people will think of these past times in their nation as better than the current times with the existence of the Communist Party. And the reason they're afraid of that is because China was better pre-Communist Party. Every nation is better before communism. It is a plague on humanity, and they are cowering authoritarians. This is what cowering authoritarians do. So you have a movie that is designed in part to be appealing to the Chinese market that the Chinese are not allowing in their market because they don't like the idea of depicting their culture and their history in such a positive way that doesn't acknowledge the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian rule and pump it up as something great. Now, I've been very critical about the way our movies pander to China in the past because I find it quite ridiculous when they do so. I mean, we watch the third act of major motion pictures, and you always see the US government and the Chinese government on the same level going after this. And the Chinese, unlike the US government in all of these movies, are always depicted as hyper competent and noble when we know the Communist Party is absolutely disgusting. And it's shameful that Americans are importing Chinese censorship in order to make a buck.
Throughout my life, the 10 rings gave our family power. If you wanted them to be yours one day, you have to show me you are strong enough to carry them.
So I was going into the theater with all that stuff in the background of my mind when I went to go see this movie. And the thing is, after watching this movie, I actually really liked it. The movie is really good. It's not that good. The Rotten Tomatoes score is absolutely absurd that it's the best superhero movie of all time, but it's a pretty damn good movie. And the reason why it's a pretty damn good movie is because this movie isn't necessarily appealing to the Chinese Communist Party, which is why it's banned there. It's appealing to Chinese people. It's trying to highlight aspects of their culture and interweave it with the Marvel mythology, and they do a pretty good job. But more fundamentally, the reason this movie is good is that it's a callback to the old kung fu movies that I used to really enjoy. A lot of people are trying to portray this as like the first time Asians ever got representation on the big screen, as if we didn't have an entire era of Asian fighting movies in the United States of America that were insanely popular, as if people like Jackie Chan never had successful careers in the United States of America, as if people like Jet Li never had successful careers in the United States of America. And this movie has some scenes and action sequences that are actually well choreographed, which is something I criticize Marvel for consistently because they have cuts for everything, and I really enjoyed it. In fact, 95% of this movie I actually really liked, and I was with it because it's also anchored by an absolutely wonderful antagonist. Now, the antagonist of this movie is the guy with the 10 rings, and although he is technically, vaguely, the real Mandarin, he's never called that in the movie, so I might go by calling him not the Mandarin throughout this movie, but don't take that as a sign of disrespect, because this was my favorite character.
I told my men they wouldn't be able to kill you if they tried. Glad I was right.
He's one of the best villains ever depicted in a Marvel movie, and that's due to the complex nuances in this guy's performance. He absolutely killed it. You see him run the wide range of a guy that is over 1,000 years old, a warrior, to somebody who falls in love, turns in the proverbial gloves. In this case, it's the 10 rings. And then he comes back because circumstances force him back in, and his motivation is to reunite his family and bring back his dead wife. These are all understandable and human motivations, and it's one of the reasons why his performance really sticks. And he ranges from, again, very sentimental, very kind-hearted, where you can sympathize with him, to incredibly brutal and nasty, and a lot of times you're rooting for him and his brutality. Like, spoiler alert, his wife dies, you see them get together, and they're the parents of Shang-Chi, our protagonist. And when he's getting revenge on the people that were responsible for his wife's death, you're kind of like, yeah, kill them. Use those 10 rings of power on them. They absolutely deserve it. And this is where I become kind of torn with this movie.
He's just a criminal who murders people.
Because yes, this movie is designed to be not for me, the general audience, but to be for the Chinese audience. But the Chinese have rejected it. And as a movie for American audiences, I think it works a lot better than other movies served up by Marvel to the American audience. I mean, Iron Man, they changed the Mandarin's character in that movie, and a lot of people say it's a clever choice, it's a bold choice, it's a risky choice. And I used to be in that camp until I realized that in part they changed the Mandarin because they wanted to clear it through the Chinese censors. So this movie, even though it has changes and it's clearly trying to be okay with the Chinese censors, is just really good on its own, and it's kind of funny that the Chinese are the people who rejected it. Like, when you're watching this, it's not disrespectful in any way at all, and the fight choreography is really interesting, the characterizations are really interesting, and up until the point where they get into the big monster battle at the end, where I start to lose interest because it's CGI monsters fighting each other, I'm 100% on board with this movie.
You are a product of all who came before you. The legacy of your family. You are your mother. And whether you like it or not, you are also your father.
Now, I'm sure some of you out there in my audience are asking yourself, what about the woke elements in this movie? What about those moments that were super woke? Well, how bad are they in this movie? And compared to other movies in the MCU, especially recent additions to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they are very minimal, to say the least. They're not a big aspect of it. I mean, one of the funnier attempts to kind of invert a stereotype in this movie is that there's a female character played by Aquafina, somebody named after the water company that Coca-Cola owns, and she's a female Asian person who's good at driving. So you can say that that's kind of like an inverse of a stereotype, and she's like your comedic relief character. She's not that distinct from Darcy's character in the Thor movies in that she's a goofy sidekick for a strange character to kind of bring him down to earth. And there's a moment where the actual Mandarin, or the not Mandarin, who's one of my favorite characters in the movie, talks about the creation of the fake persona Mandarin in Iron Man 3. And he's like, they appropriated my name and my organization, and then they named their character, the face of it, since they didn't know his name, after a chicken dish or an orange. So there's like a little bit of that where they're like, oh, cultural appropriation with the Mandarin, Iron Man's greatest villain. But honestly, it's not that big of a deal throughout this. And there's standard girl power stuff. Shang-Chi has a sister. After her and Shang-Chi's mother died, she wasn't allowed to do the training that Shang-Chi did, but she watched him from the shadows and then trained and became just as good a fighter as him, because we needed a girl power moment in there. And also the goofy sidekick learns in like a day to make an impossible bow and arrow shot, because women are trained to fight in the secret city that's totally the same as the secret city in the Iron Fist show, but not really the same as the one in the Iron Fist show. But other than that, it's not really that present, and since they're setting up the sister to be a villain in the future, it didn't really bother me that much because it fit within the character. I mean, again, we're shown the guy with the 10 rings, who's like a master of this, he's thousands of years old, getting bested by the woman that he ends up falling in love with in the beginning of the movie. So it's not unusual, based on the parameters of these movies, that men and women can fight at similar competency levels in this story. Again, a lot of people talk a lot about how, oh, in these movies, a 100-pound woman is able to beat a 300-pound dude, and that's not realistic. It's like, well, we're in a universe where a bunch of things are unrealistic, and you kind of just have to buy into the idea that in the Marvel universe or in the DC universe, we're not in the real world. So through training, the potential for a man or a woman with elite training is to do beyond what any man or woman could do in our actual universe that we live in right now. There's not the same rigid limitations. So you just got to buy into that. If you don't want to buy into that with the human characters, then, I mean, I don't know what to tell you, because Steve Rogers is technically not supposed to have any superpowers. He's supposed to be amplified through the super soldier serum to be the peak of what a human could be, and he's ridiculously overpowered in the MCU. And we see that with characters like Hawkeye and all these other human characters that can somehow fight aliens, even though they're not really powered at all. So if you don't buy into that by now, then the universe has been around for 13 years. I don't know what else to tell you. That's just the breaks of the way the world works. Now, as for the changes to the Mandarin character overall, I'm not really bothered by them in this movie, because you have to understand is that they're not going to be exactly like they are in the comics. These are adaptations in order to make the movies work. Take a movie like Civil War. In the comics, the Civil War comic book was all about secret identities, but in the MCU, not any of the major characters have a secret identity, so you can't really adapt one-to-one Civil War. Also, Civil War was really rooted in the post 9/11 world, and we've kind of moved beyond that, so you can't really tie that exactly to the source material. You have to make changes in order for it to work in the context of your universe. And since Iron Man is already dead, and they've already said that there is a real Mandarin that was being impersonated by the fake Mandarin, you have to come up with an origin for this person to work. I mean, some people are going to be mad that the rings weren't worn on his fingers, but I actually thought it was cool that he had them on his arms, both arms. They are rooted in mysticism, which is what the Mandarin was in the comic books. He's a magic-based character, which was always something questionable to put him up against in the MCU, a character like Iron Man, who's very grounded in technology anyway. And of course, Shang-Chi in the comic books was never the son of the Mandarin. So there are a bunch of changes from the comic book source material. I don't care about changes from the source material as long as the changes make the story work that you're trying to tell. Obviously, there are bad, pointless changes that ruin the movies, but none of these, in my opinion, qualify to be those stories. And honestly, the change that the Mandarin's like this thousands of year old person that found these rings that basically keep him to be immortal, and that he's basically like a Ra's al Ghul type character, I actually really enjoyed. And I actually think that he's one of the best adaptations of a Ra's al Ghul type character. So all of that was good stuff for me. And that's why, despite the politics around this movie, the fact that this was made to please a Chinese audience and the censors in China, and then was rejected by the censors in China, basically ensuring that this movie will be a financial flop because it's clearly dependent on the overseas market, specifically the Chinese market, I can confidently recommend this movie because even with all that, it's really good. Now, there's some really questionable CGI in this movie, especially later on when they go to the town that Shang-Chi's mother is from, but honestly, this is what you come to expect with Marvel that definitely overuses the computer animation in their movies. But other than that, the real problems in this movie boil down from when this stops being a story about a father and son, which it is, again, through 98% of the movie, and starts to be about the big monster escaping from the gate and taking people's souls, and they have to stop it before it ends the world. Like, the last battle between father and son, I really enjoyed it, and you feel the fear that Shang-Chi has of his father, who's such a force of nature in this movie when he's wearing those rings and he's animated, and that's what really makes this movie work. So overall, I'm going to have to once again cut against the grain when we're talking about these types of movies and tell you that if you're interested in Marvel movies, if you're interested in Kung Fu movies, this movie works on its own as an isolated story, that I would give you a recommendation for Shang-Chi, Legend of the Ten Rings. Now, there's some post-credit scenes, and people are getting all outraged that Captain Marvel showed up, and it seemed to be a depiction of the Illuminati, which, if you're not familiar, Marvel's Illuminati is like Reed Richards, Doctor Strange, Professor Xavier, and Tony Stark. Since Tony Stark is dead in the MCU, Professor Xavier hasn't been introduced yet, and neither has Reed Richards. Obviously, you're going to have a different makeup of the Illuminati, but Doctor Strange wasn't there, Wong was there, and then you had Captain Marvel show up and tell a joke about her phone number, and then you had Bruce Banner, who's not the Hulk Bruce Banner anymore. He's not Professor Hulk, without any explanation. So, like, honestly, if that bothers you, it's the end credit scene. Then you have the girl power, like the lady boss thing, where Shang-Chi's sister becomes the person to take over the organization. It's whatever. The end credit scenes are not that interesting. We just learned that the 10 rings are magical, and nobody's ever seen anything of it, and Captain Marvel hasn't encountered it in space for some reason that matters to us. And that's really it. It's an isolated story, and obviously they're saying that Shang-Chi will eventually become a part of like the Avengers or the overall Marvel universe, but the end credit scenes weren't really needed in this, and they don't really add nor do they subtract anything from the film. I know people get all crazy after they say Brie Larson. They're like, we don't like you, Brie Larson, you get out of here. But honestly, it had very little impact. She shows up for like a second. It's a bad joke, and it's not really that interesting. With that being said, because YouTube tells me that I need to increase my engagement, I'm gonna give the floor to you guys, the commenters. What did you think about this movie even? Did you even want to even watch it even? Or were you even interested even in the first place even? Or did my mind change your mind even? Let me know down in the comments below, because I really need to know what you guys think, because YouTube told me I need more comments for my engagement. As usual, you know the drill. You hit the like button if you like the video. You subscribe if you want to subscribe. I have support links if you want to throw money in my face and say thank you. They're in the description of the video, a whole bunch of them. And this has been me talking about Marvel's Shang-Chi, a movie made for Chinese propaganda purposes that can't even be shown in China. Till next time.